I'd like to talk a little bit about a subject that I haven't spoken of before, and I'm surprised I haven't actually, because it's a pretty topical thing, and I often cover issues which are newsworthy or debatable and so on. Earlier today I was watching this film. Don't know if you can see that clearly. That's the DVD cover. Lima, Breaking the Silence. Now this is it's a TV movie. It's not a big budget film, but it's still a pretty good film in terms of its execution, so to speak. Given that it's not a studio film, it's probably a relatively low budget film, TV film. I think it's worth watching. Basically, it's about the Lima Breaking the Silence. It's about the 1996-97 hostage crisis at the the Japanese ambassador's residence in Lima, Peru. Technically, it was his residence, not the embassy, but in common memory, it's known as the Japanese embassy attack. It's one of the most high-profile hostage situations ever. Partly because of the length it lasted. I believe several months. I can't remember the exact time, but several months anyway. And what happened was members of the Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Group, which was a Maoist left-wing organisation, guerrilla group, took 300 people hostage at the Japanese embassy. There was a party going on there to celebrate the birthday of Hirohito at that time. Or Akihito. Anyway, the point is, what I'd like to discuss a little bit is the whole concept of terrorism versus freedom fighters, because it's a common sort of phrase that you'll often hear in this debate. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Now, I'm from Northern Ireland. I was born in Northern Ireland, which is a part of the world which, in terms of its size, has seen more than its fair share of political violence. You may be familiar with that conflict. I don't intend to give a long chronology of that here. But I come from a part of the world that has seen terrorism, a lot of terrorism. So, going back quite a long way, this is something I did think quite a lot about. Not when I was in Northern Ireland, more when I have grown up in England, but nevertheless it's something that goes back a long way in my mindset. I've only got about 15 minutes, so if you have the patience to bear with me, I want to discuss several points around this. Now, firstly, that phrase, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, I think it insults victims of terrorism. However, I can see what the context is. I can understand the context of the saying, although I think it is offensive to victims of terrorism, because terrorists show their victims no freedom. But the word itself, terrorist, is one that is often thrown around. And quite often you have a situation where a repressive government uses the term terrorist in order to justify a crackdown. We're seeing that in Syria. We have been seeing that in Syria from the very start of the civil war there. Absolutely everyone that disagrees with the Syrian government in Syria, the state media brands a terrorist. So the Syrian state media has demonized millions of Syrian men, women and children as terrorists, simply for opposing Assad. Of course, because that situation has dragged on, there is actual terrorist groups on the ground, such as ISIS, the Al-Qaeda affiliate, and other factions. But this isn't about Syria. I don't want to make this particularly about any specific conflict. It's more about the issues in general. I think any rational person would have to look at what terrorists do and unreservedly condemn that. If you can't see that what they do is wrong, then you have a problem. However, I do think that sometimes people forget that terrorists don't just wake up one day and say, we're going to blow up a building, we're going to take people hostage, or whatever, there's always a political context to what they do. And that's not an excuse, by the way, it's just an explanation. Terrorists don't just develop like that. There's always a context to what is going on in the background, to something going on in the background. Because quite often you have a situation, this was the case in Northern Ireland, where young, mostly men, sometimes women as well, I'm talking on wider sense here, I just quoted Northern Ireland, but terrorism in general, it's usually young, disillusioned, angry men. Angry, young, disillusioned men, to put it another way. Sometimes women as well, but predominantly men. And I find, well, one important point that needs to be recognised is there is a big difference between terrorist groups themselves. So just talking about all violent organisations as terrorists, they may well be terrorists, but it's important to recognise that there's different. It's not necessarily a case that what works with one group will work with another, because some groups are interested in, their motivation is some sort of political dispute, whether it be territorial or politically ideological, as in the case of Maoist groups. Or then you have what is very widespread today, which is what I would term theocratic terrorism, or religious fundamentalism that crosses a line and turns into outright terrorism. It's pretty obvious in Nigeria there is no other way to describe Boko Haram. That's a good example of a religious terrorist organisation, Islamist to be more precise. Now, some people debate the term Islamist, but I think it's entirely valid. It's a real phenomenon, and people who think it isn't need to get their head out of the sands. So Islamism is the most obvious form of revolutionary terrorism today, but it's not the only one. And when we talk about terrorism, I think it's important to recognise that it isn't just insurgent groups or factions who are opposing a particular government in order to spread an agenda violently. There is also such a thing as state terrorism, and that shouldn't be overlooked. And I think maybe too often it is. And to give you the context of this film, it was, I thought, a good film, but a little bit too biased towards the MRTA. It tended to show them as troubled young men, one woman, and it sort of demonized the Peruvian government a bit. So clearly this particular film was biased, but most films that deal with the subject tend to take a governmental side, which is not quite, it depends on the situation. Being from Northern Ireland, I do notice that films that deal with the Troubles often take a stance that is romanticises the IRA, and that does anger me, because there's nothing romantic, there's nothing honourable about what terrorists do. Cowardly, I'm not sure if it's really the right word. I understand why it's used, but I don't think someone knowing they're going to die, regardless of how despicable that act may be, I don't think that is technically cowardly. Despicable, brutal, yes. Cowardly I'm not sure about, although I understand why the term is used. But what I'm trying to get at is there's, in relation to this phrase, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, needs to be analysed a little bit, because what one government may describe as a terrorist organisation, others, whether sympathetic to that organisation or people outside who take issue with that particular government, might say, well, they're not terrorists, they're freedom fighters. But the problem is, at what point does a freedom fighter cross the line and become a terrorist? Some would say they never are. But what I would argue is, the minute that an organisation transcends from, for example, sit-ins, direct action, specifically targeting a government or soldiers, which I'm not condoning, but I do differentiate that from what then becomes a crossover, and it's deliberate targeting of civilians. Now, in a lot of situations in Latin American conflicts, that's a good example actually, because you have a situation where the civilian population suffer the most. Colombia would be a good example, whereby the peasant communities in rural parts of Colombia are terrorized by both sides. If they don't cooperate with the likes of the FARC, then they're, in many cases, they become victims of atrocities. If they do cooperate, then the government sees them as conspiring with terrorists. So sadly, in many of these situations, the civilian population can't win, and they're put in an impossible situation. And that also applies to war, the wider subject of war. And it's happening now in Mexico with the drug war. People are finding themselves torn between government force and the brutal actions of the drug cartels. But what I want to say is that if you are someone who comes from a politically stable country such as the UK, where I come from, it's important not to be too judgmental about either side without knowing the full context. But then again, it's not even about political stability, because the dangerous thing about terrorism is it can strike absolutely anywhere. Nowhere on earth is immune. I mean, look at Norway when you had Anders Breivik, the neo-Nazi terrorist. Norway would be considered one of the most peaceful, tranquil countries on earth. So no one could have guessed that Oslo and Utøya Island would be the scene of a massacre. That, I think, highlights the point that absolutely nowhere can be absolutely complacent that they are safe. And modern conflict tends to be much more defined by sporadic terrorist attacks rather than pitched battles between standing armies, which was traditional warfare. I believe the last example really of that may be the Iran-Iraq war, when you had large-scale trench-style warfare. But pretty much every conflict since then, for the most part, hasn't been large-scale battles involving standing armies. It's been a sort of guerrilla war with a sporadic series of terrorist attacks by people with a political agenda. And that's in some ways makes conflict these days more dangerous, because the mortality rate may be lower overall than traditional battles, but it's absolutely unpredictable. You know, in the sense of traditional warfare, you would have the generals or the heads of state would come and have peace terms with each other. Nowadays, most conflicts, I'm not saying every conflict, but most conflicts is not one state against another, it's internal. So civil wars, I think, have replaced traditional international wars, although certainly that's not universal, because in the case of Ukraine that's turning into an international crisis. Anyway, I'm throwing out a lot of information here and I'm probably not constructing it very well, but I just want to throw out a lot of different thoughts about the subject. In the film, by the way, they show the Peruvian government, like I said, in a very dark light. They show, for example, them dragging these people away and torturing them for information and so on. You have to, I find often that terrorism gets more attention than repressive regimes. Quite often, people who live under repressive regimes turn a blind eye to what those regimes do. And then when an organisation forms and stands up against the repressive regime, people turn on that organisation and say, oh look, you're bringing instability to the country. But the problem is, these groups don't do themselves any favours when they deliberately target civilians. So no one can talk about being a freedom fighter when they plant a car bomb in a public market. Something like that. Now I know there's conspiracy theorists who will say, oh, it's a CIA job, it's an MI5 job, it's Mossad, etc. And I'm not so naive as to think that those organisations aren't capable of doing that. I believe they are. But in this world, I think you have to acknowledge that there are repressive regimes that brutally crush basic human rights. And in many cases, terrorist organisations start off as civil rights movements, actually. campaigning for rights of an oppressed minority, or something along those lines. And I think they eventually resort to terrorism because they argue nothing else has worked. This is the only way we can bring attention to this repressive regime. But the fundamental mistake they make is by then targeting and terrorizing the civilian population, as if trying to submit them to their will, in which case they're acting no better than the dictatorship that they claim to oppose. So all the issues here, there's certainly not enough space in one video to talk about all of them, but I just think there's two sides. Having said that, I strongly believe that there's absolutely no excuses whatsoever for what terrorist organisations do. To give a recent example, take the Kunming knife attack in China. Now, my understanding is that is a group from Xinjiang. Whatever their grievances against the Chinese government, and goodness knows I've spoken out against the Chinese government, but whatever the grievances are, mass murder of 33 unarmed Chinese civilians is not going to win you any favours. Appealing to the international community might, but terrorists lose all moral credibility when they resort to deliberately attacking civilians. And before people turn around and say, oh well, governments do that, that's where I argue state terrorism also exists. So there's a lot of issues to consider here. Thank you for watching.